The sun was setting over Riverside, casting long shadows between the neat rows of maple trees lining the peaceful streets. Officer Lee patrolled these quiet roads like he always did, steering his police cruiser past the same well-kept lawns and elegant homes he'd watched over for the past 5 years. He took pride in keeping the peace in this upscale neighborhood, though his idea of peace had always been rather selective. As the evening light painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Officer Lee noticed something, or rather, someone, that caught his attention. A young black girl, probably in her teens, was walking along the sidewalk. She wore a crisp navy blue uniform and carried a stack of books close to her chest. Her natural hair was neatly tied back, and she walked with quiet confidence, occasionally checking her phone as if confirming directions. Most people would have seen exactly what was there: a student heading home after a study session. But Officer Lee saw something different. In his mind, something wasn't right. She seemed out of place in this neighborhood where most residents were white and wealthy. He slowed his cruiser, following her at a distance, watching as she adjusted the heavy books in her arms. The girl, let's call her Lily, felt his presence. Anyone would have. The slow-moving police car trailing behind would make anyone nervous, but she kept walking, trying to stay calm. She'd been taught by her parents how to handle situations like this. Stay composed, keep your movements clear and visible, and remember you have every right to be there. Officer Lee watched as Lily paused at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. His radio crackled with routine updates from dispatch, but his attention remained fixed on her. In his mind, he was already constructing a story. Maybe she was casing the houses, maybe those books were just a cover. The thoughts came automatically, years of unchecked biases building one assumption upon another. Lily could feel her heart beating faster. The weight of the library books, advanced chemistry, calculus, and a thick novel for her English class, seemed to grow heavier with each step. Her house was just 3 blocks away, but with the police car crawling behind her, those 3 blocks felt like miles. The scene played out like countless others across the country. A person of color simply existing in a space where others thought they shouldn't be. Officer Lee's fingers drummed against his steering wheel as he watched Lily pull out her phone again. To him, every normal action looked suspicious through the lens of his prejudice. Finally, he'd seen enough, or rather, he'd imagined enough. He flicked on his cruiser's lights, the blue and red reflections dancing across the manicured hedges of nearby homes. Lily's heart sank. She knew what was coming, even though she'd done absolutely nothing wrong. Several residents peeked through their curtains at the unfolding scene. A woman walking her dog slowed her pace to watch. Officer Lee stepped out of his car, adjusting his belt with an air of authority that came from years of never having his decisions questioned. He approached Lily, his hand resting near his hip in a way that made her blood run cold. The evening breeze rustled through the maple trees, carrying the last warmth of the day. But for Lily, standing there with her books clutched to her chest, the air had turned ice cold. What should have been a simple walk home from the library was about to become something much more significant, not just for her, but for Officer Lee and the entire police department. Neither of them knew it yet, but this moment would spark changes that would ripple through their community for months to come. The evening had grown quieter, with only the distant sound of traffic breaking the tense silence. Officer Lee's boots crunched on the sidewalk as he approached Lily, who stood perfectly still, remembering everything her parents had taught her about these situations. Her heart was racing, but her face remained calm. ID. Officer Lee demanded, not even bothering with a proper greeting. His voice carried that particular tone some officers use when they've already decided someone is guilty. Of what? They're not always sure, but guilty nonetheless. Lily noticed how he stood slightly sideways, one hand still hovering near his belt, as if she, a teenage girl holding library books, posed some kind of threat. Yes, sir, Lily responded politely, keeping her voice steady despite her rising anxiety. My school ID is in my backpack. I'm just heading home from the library. She spoke clearly and calmly, just as she'd been taught. Moving slowly, she started to lower her books to reach for her bag. That's when things escalated. "Don't move," Officer Lee barked, taking a step forward. The sudden sharpness in his voice startled Lily, and the heavy books slipped from her grasp. They hit the sidewalk with a series of loud thuds, pages fluttering in the evening breeze. Her carefully borrowed library books now lay scattered around her feet like fallen leaves. A small crowd had begun to gather. An elderly man walking his dog stopped and pulled out his phone, starting to record. A couple on their porch stood up, watching intently. A car slowed as it passed, the driver craning their neck to see what was happening. "I said don't move," Officer Lee repeated, his voice hard with authority. "What are you doing in this neighborhood? These houses have had break-ins recently." This was a lie. The neighborhood hadn't seen a break-in in over a year, but Officer Lee had already crafted a narrative in his mind, and he was sticking to it. "Sir, I live here," Lily explained, her voice trembling slightly now. "My house is just 3 blocks away on Pine Street. If you'll let me show you my ID." She gestured toward her backpack again, moving with deliberate slowness. "Yeah, sure you do," Officer Lee scoffed, cutting her off. More phones had appeared in windows and on porches, recording the scene. The evening light caught the silver of his badge as he stepped closer, casting long shadows across the scattered books at Lily's feet. One of the books had fallen open to a page full of complex chemical equations. Another showed advanced calculus problems, complete with Lily's neat handwriting in the margins. These details didn't matter to Officer Lee. He'd stopped seeing details the moment he first spotted Lily walking down the street. "Turn around," he commanded, reaching for his handcuffs. "Put your hands behind your back." The metal clinked ominously in the quiet street. A neighbor gasped. Someone whispered, "This isn't right." Lily felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not now. As she turned around, she caught sight of her reflection in a car window. Her school uniform neat and pressed, her posture straight and dignified despite the humiliation of the moment. She was her father's daughter, and she would handle this with grace. The handcuffs felt cold against her wrists. Officer Lee's grip was unnecessarily tight as he led her toward his patrol car, leaving her books scattered on the sidewalk like evidence at a crime scene. The neighbors watched, their phones recording every moment, as a young honor student was treated like a criminal for the simple act of walking home. What Officer Lee didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that this moment would come back to haunt him in ways he never imagined. Sometimes the biggest mistakes come from the smallest moments of prejudice, and this mistake was about to change more lives than just Lily's. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Officer Lee marched Lily through the front doors. The desk sergeant looked up, surprise flickering across his face at the sight of a teenage girl in a school uniform being led in like a dangerous criminal. A few other officers paused in their work, watching the scene unfold with varying degrees of concern. The processing room was cold, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. Officer Lee sat at his desk, typing up his report with an air of satisfaction, while Lily sat quietly on a hard plastic chair nearby. Her wrists were still red from where the handcuffs had been too tight, but she kept her composure even as her mind raced with worry about her parents. "I need to call my father," Lily said firmly, breaking the tense silence. Her voice echoed slightly in the sparse room. "It's my right to make a phone call." She'd learned about civil rights in school, and despite her fear, she knew she had to stand up for herself. Officer Lee barely glanced up from his computer screen. "You'll get your phone call when I'm good and ready," he replied, his fingers continuing to tap away at the keyboard. He was writing his version of events. A story that painted Lily as suspicious, uncooperative, and out of place in that neighborhood. Through the window of the processing room, other officers walked past, some doing double takes at the sight of Lily. One young officer even paused, looking like he wanted to say something, but then hurried along when Officer Lee shot him a warning look. The wall clock ticked loudly, marking each minute that passed without Lily being allowed to contact her family. The room smelled of stale coffee and printer ink. A radio crackled somewhere in the background, dispatchers calling out codes and addresses in their practiced, neutral tones. Lily noticed a family photo on Officer Lee's desk, him smiling with his own teenage daughter at what looked like a graduation ceremony. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Sir?" Lily tried again, her voice steady despite her growing anxiety. "My parents will be worried. I was supposed to be home 20 minutes ago." She watched as Officer Lee's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as if her reasonable request was somehow in challenge to his authority. A few desks away, an older officer looked up from his paperwork, frowning at the scene. Something about this didn't sit right with him. A teenager in a private school uniform, clearly well-spoken and calm, being treated like she'd committed a serious crime. But like the young officer before him, he said nothing, turning back to his work with a troubled expression. Officer Lee finally turned to face Lily, his chair squeaking in the quiet room. "Listen here," he started, his voice carrying that false patience some adults use when they think they're being reasonable but are actually being anything but. "You were suspicious in a high-end neighborhood. You resisted when I asked for identification. You're going to sit there until I finish processing you, and then maybe we'll talk about that phone call." What Officer Lee didn't realize was that at that very moment, the evening shift was changing. The day shift was heading out, and the night shift was coming in. Among them was someone whose arrival would turn Officer Lee's smug certainty into cold dread. The department's leadership was about to learn exactly how one of their officers treated young people in their community. The door at the end of the hallway opened, and footsteps echoed on the tile floor. Officer Lee, still focusing on his report, didn't look up. Lily, however, felt her heart leap with relief as she recognized the sound of those familiar footsteps. Sometimes justice arrives in unexpected ways, and for Officer Lee, justice was about to walk right through that door. The sound of footsteps grew louder in the hallway, mixing with the familiar evening sounds of the police station. Officer Lee continued typing his report, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he embellished the details of his successful arrest. The clicking of his keyboard stopped abruptly when a deep, authoritative voice cut through the air. "What's going on here?" The police chief stood in the doorway, his presence commanding immediate attention. Officer Lee's spine straightened automatically, the way it always did when the chief walked into a room. But before he could answer, something unexpected happened. "Dad." Lily's voice carried both relief and lingering anxiety. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Officer Lee's face went from confident to confused to horrified in the span of seconds. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The chief's daughter. He'd arrested the chief's daughter. Baby girl. The chief's voice softened for just a moment before hardening again as he turned to Officer Lee. "Would someone like to explain why my daughter is sitting here in handcuffs?" The other officers in the room had frozen in place. Someone's coffee cup stopped halfway to their mouth. The only sound was the constant buzz of the fluorescent lights and the distant ringing of phones at the front desk. Officer Lee stood up so quickly his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "Sir, I didn't know." His words tumbled out, tripping over each other. The smug confidence from earlier had evaporated like morning dew in hot sun. "You didn't know." The chief's voice was dangerously quiet as he walked over to his daughter. With gentle hands, he helped her stand and carefully removed the handcuffs. "You didn't know, so you arrested a teenage girl walking home from the library. Those are her books scattered on the sidewalk 6 blocks from here." The chief's eyes swept across Officer Lee's computer screen, reading the half-finished report. His jaw tightened as he took in the words, "suspicious behavior, uncooperative, matching the description. The same old phrases used to justify the same old prejudices. Other officers had started gathering in the doorway, drawn by the scene unfolding before them. They watched as their chief gently rubbed his daughter's wrists where the handcuffs had left marks. The silence in the room was heavy with unspoken thoughts and realizations. Officer Lee, the chief's voice cut through the silence. My daughter has straight A's. She tutors younger kids after school. She's never been in trouble a day in her life. He paused, letting the words sink in. But you saw a black teenager in a nice neighborhood and made assumptions, didn't you? Officer Lee's face had gone pale. The family photo on his desk, the one of his own daughter's graduation, seemed to mock him now. The chief noticed it too, his eyes lingering on the frame for a moment. Badge and gun, the chief said quietly. On my desk. Now. Each word fell like a hammer blow in the silent room. And after that, you can explain to Internal Affairs exactly what made a straight-A student walking home from the library look suspicious to you. The gathered officers watched as their colleague slowly unpinned his badge, his hands trembling slightly. This wasn't just about one wrongful arrest anymore. This was a moment of reckoning, not just for Officer Lee, but for the entire department. The chief wrapped a protective arm around his daughter's shoulders. Let's get your books, sweetheart, he said softly. Then we need to have a long talk about what happened here today. As they walked toward the door, he paused and looked back at the still stunned room. And tomorrow, we're going to have an even longer talk about what changes need to happen in this department. The next morning arrived with a tension that hung over the police station like storm clouds. Officers spoke in whispers as they passed the chief's office, where the blinds were drawn tight. Inside, the chief sat behind his desk, his face lined with the weight of both personal and professional burden. Officer Lee sat across from him, no longer in uniform. He wore civilian clothes, a plain button-down shirt and slacks that somehow made him look smaller than he had in his police blues. The badge and gun he'd surrendered the night before lay on the desk between them, like evidence in their own kind of trial. 20 years, the chief began, his voice level but filled with purpose. I've spent 20 years working to build trust between this department and our community. 20 years of trying to show people that the badge means protection, not fear. He picked up the incident report from the previous night. And in one evening, you managed to prove every critic right. Through the office window's half-closed blinds, the morning sun cast strips of light across the room. They could see other officers trying to steal glances as they walked past, curious about what was happening in this closed-door meeting. Sir, if I had known she was your daughter. Officer Lee started, but the chief cut him off with a raised hand. Stop right there. The chief's voice carried the weight of exhaustion and disappointment. That's exactly the problem. It shouldn't matter whose daughter she is. She could have been anyone's daughter. A judge's daughter, a janitor's daughter, or a daughter with no father at all. It shouldn't make any difference. Officer Lee shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For the first time, he was being forced to face his actions without the shield of his badge to hide behind. The morning light caught his face, showing the dark circles under his eyes. Evidence of a sleepless night. Tell me something, the chief continued, leaning forward slightly. When you saw my daughter walking home, what exactly made her look suspicious to you? Was it the school uniform? The library books? Or was it something else? Something you don't want to say out loud because saying it would make it too real. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. Outside the office, the usual morning bustle of the station continued. Phones ringing, officers checking in, coffee brewing in the break room. But in here, time seemed to stand still as Officer Lee struggled to find words that wouldn't come. I have your body camera footage from last night, the chief said, tapping his computer screen. I watched it 3 times. I watched how you followed her for 2 blocks before stopping her. I saw how you ignored her explanation about the library. I heard how your voice changed when she reached for her ID. the same reaching motion you've seen hundreds of times during traffic stops without incident. Officer Lee's face flushed red with shame. The evidence was there, impossible to deny when laid out so clearly. His own actions, seen through different eyes, told a story he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Internal Affairs will handle the official investigation, the chief continued, his voice firm, but not unkind. But right now, I want you to understand something. That girl you arrested, she's been getting straight A's since kindergarten. She volunteers at the library where you found her suspiciously carrying books. She wants to be a doctor. The chief stood up, walking to his office window. He adjusted the blinds, letting more morning light stream in. But last night, none of that mattered to you. You didn't see a student or a volunteer or a future doctor. You just saw a black teenager in what you decided was the wrong neighborhood. And that's why we're here now. The weight of those words filled the room. This wasn't just about one officer and one mistake anymore. It was about patterns, assumptions, and the hard work of real change. The morning light continued to stream through the window, illuminating dust particles in the air, small things made visible only when you took the time to really look. The Internal Affairs office buzzed with activity as investigators dug deeper into Officer Lee's past record. The room was filled with the sound of keyboards clicking and papers shuffling as years of patrol records, traffic stops, and civilian complaints were pulled from filing cabinets and computer databases. Lead investigator Chen sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and open folders. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten as she pieced together a pattern that became clearer with each document she reviewed. On her computer screen, she played Officer Lee's body camera footage from that evening for the 5th time. "You need to see this," she called to her partner, pointing at her screen. The footage showed not just Lily's arrest, but 3 other similar incidents from the past month alone. Young people of color, all stopped in the same neighborhood, all for what Officer Lee had termed suspicious behavior. In the background, a junior investigator walked in with another stack of papers. "We found more complaints," he said, placing them on Chen's desk. Most of them were marked as resolved with no action taken. His voice carried a note of frustration that matched the tired determination in Chen's eyes. The investigation room's walls were covered with photos and timeline charts. Red strings connected similar incidents, creating a web of evidence that was impossible to ignore. Officer Lee's face appeared in report after report, each one showing the same pattern of behavior. "Look at this," Chen's partner called from across the room. He held up an old complaint form from 2 years ago. A black honors student was stopped while jogging in the morning. Lee claimed he matched the description of a robbery suspect, but there hadn't been any robberies reported that month. Chen rubbed her temples, fighting off a headache. The evidence was overwhelming, but what troubled her most was how long this had gone unchecked. Other officers had seen it happening. Some had even filed concerns with their supervisors. But somehow, nothing had changed. The door opened, and a young officer stepped in. He looked nervous, fidgeting with his notepad. "Ma'am," he addressed Chen, I need to report something about Officer Lee. Something I saw a few months ago, but didn't say anything about at the time." Chen gestured to an empty chair, her expression encouraging. As the young officer sat down, more officers began trickling in throughout the day. Each carried their own stories, their own moments of witnessing something wrong and staying silent. The wall of silence was finally cracking. One officer described watching Lee perform unnecessary searches during routine traffic stops, but only for certain drivers. Another remembered how Lee would often patrol certain neighborhoods, following young people of color who were simply walking home from school or work. By late afternoon, Chen's office had become a gathering place for truth. Officers who had stayed quiet for years found their voices, sharing incidents they'd witnessed but never reported. Some spoke with shame, others with relief at finally unburdening themselves. The body camera footage played again on Chen's screen, showing Lily standing calmly, while Lee grew increasingly aggressive. But now, with context from years of similar incidents, it wasn't just one wrong arrest. It was the latest link in a long chain of biased policing. "We have enough," Chen finally announced, closing the last folder. Her team nodded in agreement. This wasn't just about punishing one officer anymore. This was about addressing a system that had allowed these behaviors to continue unchecked for so long. As the sun began to set outside the investigation room's windows, Chen started writing her final report. The evidence was clear, the pattern undeniable. But more importantly, the culture of silence that had protected these actions was finally breaking down. Real change would only come when everyone, from senior officers to new recruits, felt responsible for speaking up when they saw something wrong. The department would never be the same after this investigation. And maybe, Chen thought as she typed, that was exactly what needed to happen. The hearing room felt smaller than it actually was, packed with officers, community members, and local media. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust particles in the air as Officer Lee sat before the police review board. His shoulders slumped under his civilian clothes, the weight of his actions visible in every line of his face. The chief had stepped aside from this case, ensuring complete transparency. Instead, a panel of 5 senior officers from neighboring districts, along with 3 civilian oversight members, sat at the raised desk. They'd spent the morning reviewing evidence that painted a clear picture of years of biased policing. Officer Lee, the head of the review board, spoke, her voice carrying across the hushed room. "We've reviewed Investigator Chen's findings. Over the past 5 years, you've stopped and questioned 217 people in the Riverside area. Of those stops, 189 involved young people of color. Would you care to explain this pattern?" The room held its breath. In the front row, Lily sat with her parents, her back straight, her expression calm. She'd insisted on being here, saying that running away from difficult moments never solved anything. Her presence made the evidence even more powerful. Officer Lee cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, sounded rough and uncertain. "I was just doing my job," he began, but murmurs of disagreement rippled through the crowd. He tried again. "I was trying to keep the neighborhood safe." "Safe from whom?" A civilian board member asked quietly. "Safe from honor students carrying library books. Safe from young people walking home from work? Please help us understand your definition of safety." The evidence continued to unfold. Body camera footage played on large screens, showing incident after incident. Each clip showed the same pattern. Routine situations escalated without cause, assumptions made without evidence, fear created where none should have existed. A young officer stepped forward to testify. His voice shook slightly as he described watching Lee profile young people of color, how he'd wanted to speak up but feared retaliation. More officers followed, each adding their piece to the puzzle, breaking years of silence. Then came the community members. Parents spoke about their children being stopped and questioned while walking home from school. A local business owner described watching Lee follow young customers around his store. A teacher talked about her students' fear of walking to the library. As each person spoke, Officer Lee seemed to shrink further into his chair. The reality he'd created through his actions was impossible to ignore when faced with so many voices, so many stories, so much pain. "Officer Lee," the board head spoke again, "your actions have not only harmed individuals and families in this community. You've damaged the trust between law enforcement and the people we're sworn to protect. That trust is essential to effective policing, and rebuilding it will take years." The afternoon light had shifted, casting long shadows across the hearing room floor. The board members conferred quietly among themselves, though their decision had likely been made long before this moment. Based on the evidence presented, the head of the board announced, "We find that Officer Lee has engaged in a clear pattern of biased policing. His actions have violated department policy, community trust, and the basic principles of justice we're sworn to uphold." The consequences were laid out clearly: immediate termination, permanent record of the findings, mandatory completion of extensive bias training before being eligible for any future law enforcement position. But more than the official punishment, it was the weight of public accountability that seemed to hit Officer Lee hardest. As the room began to empty, Lily and her father stood talking quietly with community members. Their presence reminded everyone that this wasn't just about punishing one officer. It was about setting a new standard, about saying clearly that bias had no place in modern policing. The sun was setting as people left the hearing room, its orange light painting the sky in colors of change. Sometimes, justice comes not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments of truth, in communities standing together, in systems finally acknowledging their flaws and committing to do better. 3 months after the hearing, the police station's community room looked different. The once formal space had been transformed with bright posters, comfortable chairs arranged in a circle, and a whiteboard covered with ideas and suggestions. Lily stood at the front of the room, addressing a group of young police cadets. "The day I was arrested changed more than just my life," she said, her voice clear and confident. "It showed us all that silence isn't neutral. Silence is permission for wrong things to continue." The cadets listened intently, many taking notes, others nodding in understanding. This was the 4th session of the new Youth Police Partnership Program that Lily had helped create. What had started as a response to her own experience had grown into something bigger, a bridge between law enforcement and young people in the community. At the back of the room, her father, the chief, watched with pride. He'd supported Lily's idea from the start, knowing that real change needed more than just new rules and policies. It needed new understanding, new conversations, and new perspectives. The program wasn't just talk. Each week, officers and teenagers worked together on community projects. They cleaned up parks, tutored younger kids, and organized sports events. Through shared work came shared understanding, breaking down the walls of fear and mistrust one brick at a time. Today's session focused on bias and perception. Lily shared her story, but she also invited other young people to share theirs. A teenage boy talked about being followed in stores. A girl described being questioned for sitting in her own front yard. Each story added another layer of understanding. "But we're not here just to talk about problems," Lily continued, turning to the whiteboard. "We're here to create solutions." She wrote "Change starts with us" at the top, then looked back at the group. What can we do differently tomorrow that we didn't do today? The cadets, who just months ago might have stayed silent, now raised their hands eagerly. One suggested regular community meetings where officers could get to know local families. Another proposed joint training sessions where young people could help teach new officers about their experiences. In another room down the hall, a different kind of change was happening. Former Officer Lee sat with a counselor and bias training specialist, working through his own journey of understanding. The man who had once arrested Lily for walking while black was now learning to confront his own prejudices. It wasn't easy work. Lee had to face uncomfortable truths about himself, his assumptions, and the harm he'd caused. But seeing Lily turn her experience into positive change had sparked something in him too. A desire to be part of the solution rather than remain part of the problem. Back in the community room, the session ended with an exercise Lily had created. Officers and teenagers paired up, sharing not just their fears and concerns, but their hopes for the future. The room filled with conversation, laughter, and the sound of barriers breaking down. "Remember," Lily said as the session wrapped up, "change isn't just about policies or procedures. It's about people. It's about choosing to see each other as human beings first." She gestured to the posters on the walls. Photos of recent community events where officers and young people worked side by side. As people began to leave, many stopped to talk with Lily, sharing ideas or asking questions. A young cadet approached her shyly, admitting that the session had made her rethink some of her own assumptions. This was how change happened. One conversation, one realization, one person at a time. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching the words on the whiteboard. Below, change starts with us. The space was filled with ideas, commitments, and plans for the future. It was more than just writing on a board. It was a blueprint for building trust where fear had once lived. 6 months had passed since that evening when a simple walk home from the library changed everything. The police station's main conference room was packed with reporters, community members, and officers from departments across the state. They'd all come to see what local news was calling the Riverside Revolution. The chief stood at the podium, his daughter Lily beside him, as he presented the department's new community engagement statistics. The numbers told a story of remarkable change. Civilian complaints down by 60%, community trust ratings at an all-time high, and youth participation in police programs increased tenfold. What happened 6 months ago was a wake-up call, the chief began, his voice carrying across the hushed room. But what's happened since then is nothing short of a transformation. He gestured to the screens behind him, showing photos of recent community events, training sessions, and youth programs. In the audience sat the former Officer Lee. He completed his bias training and counseling, and now worked with a nonprofit organization that focused on building bridges between police and communities. The man who once profiled young people of color now spoke at police academies about the importance of confronting personal bias. Our department has become a model for others. Lily spoke next, her confidence evident in every word. But the real change isn't in our policies or our programs. It's in the conversations happening every day between officers and young people who once feared them. The presentation included video clips of recent community initiatives. Officers playing basketball with local kids, helping with homework at the library, and participating in neighborhood cleanup projects. These weren't just photo opportunities, they were real relationships being built day by day. A young officer stood to share her experience. 6 months ago, I was afraid to speak up when I saw something wrong, she admitted. Now, our entire culture has changed. We don't just talk about doing better, we show it in our actions every day. The chief then introduced their newest initiative, a partnership with local schools to create dialogue sessions between students and officers. The program, inspired by Lily's experiences, would help young people understand their rights while helping officers understand the communities they served. In the back of the room, several teenagers from Lily's youth program watched proudly. They weren't just observers anymore. They were active participants in creating change. One of them had even decided to become a police officer, saying she wanted to be part of this new way of protecting and serving. But our work isn't finished, the chief continued, his voice growing serious. Change isn't a destination. It's a journey. Every day, we have to choose to do better than we did the day before. He looked at his daughter, then back at the audience. Every interaction is a chance to build trust or break it. The presentation ended with a surprise announcement. The department's new training program, developed with input from community members and civil rights organizations, would be shared with police departments nationwide. What had started as one painful incident was now sparking change across the country. As the formal presentation ended, people didn't rush to leave. Instead, they gathered in small groups, sharing ideas and experiences. Officers chatted with teenagers, parents talked with department leaders, and reporters scribbled notes about what real community policing could look like. Lily stood with her father, watching the scene before them. What had begun with her arrest had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. It wasn't just about preventing future incidents. It was about building a new kind of relationship between police and community. "You did good, kiddo," the chief said quietly to his daughter. She smiled, watching as a group of young officers talked animatedly with some local teenagers about their latest community project. "We did good," she corrected him. "All of us, together." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, lighting up the room with a warm glow. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments and the bravery to turn pain into purpose.